Engineer Joseph Siror is the managing director and CEO of Kenya Power, and I can already see the sparks are already starting to fly, literally, in the hot seat of Kenya's biggest conversation this morning, the Situation Room. Engineer, good morning.
Good morning, Du.
Good morning, Karibu Sana. There have been many questions. There have been many issues arising. Today we're looking at the higher than rising cost of electricity in the country today, and the many things around Kenya Power and exactly what the mandate is to supply and deliver and distribute, along the lines of some of the things that we've seen come out of the Auditor General's office. But let's start from the very beginning. I think we often confuse ourselves when it comes to power in this country. Let's start from the very beginning. What is Kenya Power supposed to do for us in Kenya? What is the mandate? What do you provide? What's Kenya Power's job?
The role of Kenya Power, or rather, there are three main areas of supply of power in the country. There are those who generate the power. Then there are those who transmit. Then Kenya Power comes in to retail or to distribute and retail. Mm-hmm. So the role of Kenya Power is to play that last mile role of supplying power to the customer or to the consumers, and also supporting them in the provision of that power. I do know that even currently as constituted, Kenya Power also does play a little role in terms of transmission of power. So we do have some transmission lines, and we also have the distribution lines, and finally, of course, the last mile, which is connecting to the consumers, billing them, and also supporting them.
Is Kenya Power the only one in the country who does that or plays that role of retailing and distributing power?
Currently, Kenya Power is the only off-taker, but in terms of the Energy Act, it allows multiple players. So it's not that it's the single off-taker by choice. I think it's more of a single off-taker by virtue of the fact that none others have actually entered into that space to supply that power. But it is allowed in the Act, in the Energy Act.
Okay. So the power that Kenya Power then retails and distributes, where does it come from? Who gets it from point A to Kenya Power? Who essentially gives it to you to then distribute and retail?
There are many generators in the country. The largest, of course, is the public utility, Kenyan, where they have a number of hydros. They were the front runners, really. You wouldn't really call them front runners. Initially, it was all under one company, that is Kenya Power. And then, of course, it unbundled, and Kenyan started dealing with all the generations. There is also others like REREC. They are then independent power producers. So there are quite a number of players in that space. Now, after generation, one has to transmit. And that is where Kenya Electricity Transmission Company comes in. And I also did indicate that for the older lines, Kenya Power also has some old transmission lines. And so we come at the last end, but also we do have power which we import from the region. One of the countries we import from is Uganda, UETCL, and we also import from Ethiopia, that is AEP. Okay. So that is really the space of those who generate. And then there is the space of those who transmit, and then Kenya Power comes in to distribute and to retail.
Okay. Who determines how much power will cost? We get a bill, right? Or we buy tokens and then we see all of that. What role does Kenya Power play in telling us now, at the end of the day, this is what you've consumed, this is how much it's going to cost, or this is how much you've bought, and this is how we've distributed your shillings and cents? Where does Kenya Power's role in that come in?
In coming up with the eventual tariff that is charged to the end user, there are a number of players in that space. And the one who regulates that is IPRA. IPRA is the body that regulates that particular space. And in terms of that regulation, they are the ones who determine, for example, or let me backpedal a bit and say this. Different sources of power cost differently in terms of that generation. The cheapest source, I think, would be nuclear, which we don't have in Kenya. Now, in our context, the cheapest source is hydro. hydro is the cheapest source. So when you have an hydro generation, you would always enjoy the lowest because it costs the least to actually generate using hydro. Then we have other generation sources like geothermal. We also have solar. We have wind. And each of them comes up with a sort of a tariff. In the far past, they were coming when first Kenya Power unbundled and Kenyan came out. It was then necessary to agree on what they would be paid by virtue of that generation. And the instrument which was then used to come up with that figure was a PPA, which is a negotiated document. That is negotiation between Kenya Power and Kenyan at the time, and also a very big role of the government in ensuring that the tariff that is then agreed is actually reasonable and each of the parties are well taken care of and that it's actually fair. But as time progressed, Ndu and Muga, there came a time when there was a very serious drought in Kenya. And by virtue of that drought, I think which happened somewhere between 1995 and possibly around 2000.
Yes.
The country, and this is the time when the financial donors or the financial institutions had sort of pulled out of the country. So, and they have been the main drivers, and we do really appreciate their support in terms of the major and the big projects for power generation. And now when they pulled out of the country was staring at a situation where there would be massive load shedding and or rather lack of power in the country.
Yeah.
And what then had to happen is that the government had to think very quickly, we need private investors to come in very quickly and invest. And because of that urgency, to get all these powers, of course, there had to be some quick negotiations, financiers were to finance, needed to be guaranteed of their investment. So there are a number of discussions which went into that space, and that now saw other IPPs come into the space to provide the power.
Okay.
Yeah.
So they were invited to come in because of what you've said.
Exactly.
Right?
Because of a challenge that the country was facing.
Okay. Was there a regulatory framework under which they were then going to operate? Or because by virtue of the fact that they then came into the country to produce power which was lacking in the country, they were then allowed to do whatever they want. They dictated the terms and how much they would charge or how much it would cost, and entering into contracts which we now then are paying for today. How were they regulated, and how are they regulated to date?
I would say there was a regulatory environment, but like I said before, this was a situation that just emerges. So in terms of even the regulatory framework, it may not be as mature as we have it today. A number of times when you're entering into a particular matter for the first time, there are a number of factors you might miss, but definitely there were negotiations, there were parties who were negotiating. So it would not really be true to say that they would dictate, but it would maybe be true to say that at times when you are under so much pressure, there is the risk of you ceding some ground and not having a very high leverage in negotiating for the terms that you desire, especially if you are facing a very big challenge.
Okay. We're going somewhere, right? Engineer Siror. Now, fast forward to present day. The IPPs come in. They essentially are the savior, right? Because we can avoid load shedding in Kenya.
Absolutely.
You can avoid the lack of adequate power that can reach the country. They come in, they produce power. You then provide it to, the country. They pay for it. They get what they need. Everybody is happy. Until today, whereby more power than is being consumed in the country is available. Is it not? There's more power being produced in the country than is being consumed. Is that the case?
Theoretically, yes. Practically, may not be true.
So what is practical here?
When we give and we say that the power capacity in the country is about 3,200 megawatts, it is assuming that all the dams are full. It is making an assumption that at times may not be true. So there have been cases where, yes, you want to dispatch as much hydro as possible. But during a time even like right now, where there's been elements of drought, but it's now that the rains are coming in, you would want to dispatch the dams, but they are not there. So in theory, you have the 3,200. But in practice, on a particular day, you want to dispatch, and by the time some could not even be dispatching by virtue of the low hydrology. So there are a number of factors which at times make the practical different from the theoretical. Let me give you another example. We would say theoretically, for example, the electrical and wind power will generate 300 megawatts. A cloud cover or it rains and it drops to zero. So yes, in theory, you would have counted 300 megawatts to be available. But in practice on that particular day, the 300 megawatts are not available. You talk about solar plants. They can generate 211 possibly in total megawatts. Cloud covers, and all of them are out. So you would, at times the reality vis-a-vis the theoretical is actually distinguished from that particular perspective. Or at times again, some of the generators are out. They need to be maintained. So in the mix, you would have counted and you'll always be shouting that we have 3,200 megawatts, we have more power than we need. But in reality, many are the times when that is not the case.
Okay.
When we think of power, the production of it, the availability of it, I want to go back into history. People who were not in Kenya in 1995 may not realize it or may not know just how dire the situation was. We had power outages like a nonsense.
Absolutely.
It was disconcerting. In fact, you even when the government, Kenya Power, announced there would be power outages, there were others that they hadn't announced. So it was a fairly chaotic situation. But also, it is a time when everything that had to do with power, and I mean everything, was under Kenya Power. So IPPs, private, all these things were new. They were completely new. We had never had an experience of these things before. So into the situation that you describe, yes, people who understood this probably better than we do may have understood the benefits of it. But the truth is this. Every time you look at a situation in hindsight, there are things one is not likely to see. Or one forgets the circumstances that we were in and what brought us to the position that we are actually in. But with the initial IPPs, other IPPs came into being. Now, when these other IPPs came in, what gap were they filling? Because the drought of 1995 was not a never-ending drought. It came to an end. And things stabilized, and we understood a little bit more about what needed to be done. But more IPPs came in, mostly during the time when President Kibaki was here. What gap or what role were these IPPs playing?
Yeah, it is good you've really captured, and I appreciate the fact that you have even assisted me to answer that question. in terms of the situation that was then prevailing,
he charges in tokens.
Then I think we'll give you some credit on tokens, but that is not official because all the tokens have to be paid for. Now, yes, it is true, and you've really captured it correctly that it was during the time of Kibaki, and maybe you may need to fall back and say what was happening during Kibaki's time. And I think everybody listening would know that there was an economic growth. And whenever there is an economic growth, that is, new industries are coming in, the new businesses are coming in. So that would entail then expanding the electricity network. Indeed, if you compare where the electricity network was when Kibaki came in and now, it is many, many, many times more. And indeed, during the last almost 10 years, the number of people who have been connected onto the grid are quite a number. And that would then, it would be obvious that then the demand for power will actually be increasing commensurate to that particular increase. So the new IPPs were coming in essentially to fill in the gap that was being introduced because of the expanding network, increasing industry, increasing population, increasing institutions. So when each and every factor of the economy is increasing, all of them, of course, need to be connected. And that is actually why the power demand would always increase. Okay. And we're even projecting this year that it may actually increase by 6%. Okay. And that 6% has to be catered for.
Now, as the demand increases, does that mean that the production of power also increases? Or are we saying that the power that is being produced, regardless of the demand increasing on a national scale, it's going to be able to cater for an increased demand?
Every generation has its capacity.
Okay.
Like if I give you, for example, Tarkwel, which is one of the most stable and one of the best dams in the country, its capacity is 106 megawatts.
Yes.
At inception, that is actually what it was set to produce.
Okay.
So it's never going to increase.
Okay.
Of course, it is possible at times to bring in newer machines and to increase, but that is not even something I've looked at. But definitely for every generation, there is the power that it can generate.
Okay.
So that is to say that it cannot go beyond that unless, of course, you change the technology.
Beautiful.
So that, yes.
So fantastic. So now, if that is the case, and we know that all of these generators, as it were, are set to capacity at inception, and that means that for demand, future demand, this is going to continue to produce at its capacity. Why do we see the continuous increase of power at the user?
I didn't quite get that, Ndu. Maybe come again.
If this generator,
Yes.
at inception, we already know the maximum that it can produce at. You know that it will keep producing. It'll keep producing. It'll do that. Even if there's future demand, it'll keep producing, isn't it? We're not asking it to do more than it can, or say that, okay, now that we have more demand around the country, please Tarquin do more, right? So there's a price that you attribute to a unit of power that an individual will use and pay for at their home.
True.
So now when you're adding more people onto the grid because of demand, why does the price then for an individual who was already using the power keep rising?
Okay, I think that's a very good question. Thank you so much, Ndu, for that question. When you look at what builds up into the tariff, there are a number of components. Indeed, the tariff that is passed to the consumer today is a summation of all the requirements for the energy sector. That is to say, it must take care of the cost of generation, it must take care of the cost of transmission, it must take care of the cost of distribution, and of course that retailing, besides some levies which are to support some of the energy sector agencies, and possibly even the water bodies like WARMA, which is again added, and then on top there are taxes. Now, when you look at that, if you don't invest anything, if we were just to retain the investments as they were, say, 10 years ago, indeed, the cost of power would be quite cheap. And the reason being, the capital investment, addition is not coming in. But the moment now you start investing new plants, the moment you start expanding, then there is a capital injection that has to be recovered using that tariff. And it is for that reason that as we continue investing more into the energy sector, into generation, into transmission, because if you look at even how transmission was a few years ago, and where we are today, it is quite different. So all these investments have to find a way to be or to be recovered, their cost to be recovered using the tariff. But the beautiful thing, and possibly that is the assurance I can give, is that as the capital investment is being recovered using the tariff, there is a timeline within which it will be fully recovered. Once it is fully recovered, then it drops to the list. Like I can tell you today that the cheapest power source is actually Olkaria 1 Unit 6. I think it goes for less than 3 shillings. And the reason is all the capital investment that was used to construct it has been recovered. Okay. So the only thing that is remaining on the tariff is what is called operations and maintenance, the cost of maintaining it.
Who uses it?
Who uses?
Where does that power go from Olkaria, for example?
Okay, let me now possibly just explain this. That what ordinarily happens on a day-to-day basis is, first of all, there is what is called the National Control Center. The National Control Center would estimate the amount of the power demand using the previous records of what, say, we would consume tomorrow. Now, what would happen then, power will be dispatched according to the merit order. What we mean by the merit order here, first of all, we first of all take the ones which must dispatch. Once those ones are in, then you now look at which is the next cheapest cost to add in to the grid. So you keep adding from the cheapest until you have exhausted. But if at the point, even at any point, you are unable to deal with the power demand, then you will need to inject more and more and more. And at the tail end is where you actually have the thermos coming in to meet the shortfall. And let me also explain this, Ndu and Amuga, that when you look at our power consumption in Kenya, there is a curve. Like, for example, maybe right now, I don't know, but if I were to communicate to the national control, we may be consuming right now maybe around 1,600 megawatts. So at this point in time, we may be consuming 1,600. But by 9 o'clock, Ndu and Muga, we may actually have gone to about 2,000 or over 2,000. There is a curve. It varies from low to highs. And then from around 10 p.m., it drops almost to maybe around 1,500 again. By midnight, we are back to almost 1,000. And that is how the power curve is. So during the time when the power consumption is lower, then you may not need to dispatch the more expensive ones, because you can meet that demand by just dispatching the cheaper ones. But the moment you start approaching the 9 o'clock, the 8, 9 o'clock, when the peak now is going above 2,000, you will have dispatched all the cheap sources, but you are still unable to meet the demand. So you have now to inject the more expensive ones to meet that demand, so that you avoid the risk of load shedding anybody who wants to come in and possibly there's no power to dispatch. So that is really how the power is dispatched on a day-to-day basis.
I like what I've heard.
You like it?
No, because it means from today, 7 o'clock, I stop using power. I use a kerosene lamp.
Yeah, and it should be, then you still have your tokens left over in the
But
morning.
in fact, I will not have a problem. I'll just be consuming the cheap ones. Following day, 7 o'clock,
Put on the light.
everything off.
Yeah.
Kerosene.
We use it. Engineer Siror.
No, let me respond to that first. Let me respond to that first. I want him to live for long. If he uses kerosene, I may not guarantee. He's such a good person we need here, so we don't want his life to be shortened because of the fumes of kerosene and all that. We really want long life for you guys. Yeah.
You want us to go on a break?
I do, but so is it true that if you switch off your lights then in the evening, then this token that you've bought is going to go a little bit longer for you if you don't use, because essentially what we're saying is that if you don't use your heavy energy consumers in your home at night, your token will go longer, because now everybody is said to be on the thing using it at those hours between 8 to 11 p.m.
No, let me correct that. That, for example, last year we sold 12,000 gigawatt hours. So what then happens to agree on the tariff after looking at all the revenue requirements for the sector is to say that what do we project to sell this year? If it is such that now it is 12,000 or 12,000 plus another 6%, of course there are the issue of losses, which I know is quite emotive, and I feel that we may have to go into that area in the course of this discussion. Now, if you add the 6% to that, we'll then assume that possibly we may sell about 13,000, and now we pick that 13,000 gigawatt hours and divide by all the revenue requirements to arrive at the tariff. That is to say this, and this is really the message I want to get out there, that if there was a way we can encourage more usage, and especially during off-peak, because right now you have a situation where there is generation now. If you talk about we have excess generation at midnight, I would actually agree with you, because when you look at what is being consumed vis-a-vis the capacity for generation, there is a lot of spare generation which we are not using. Now, if we could encourage each and every person and even the industry to make and even take advantage, because we even introduced a tariff called the time of use tariff, and the reason why we introduced that is to spur additional demand. So if we were able, for example, to push the demand so that we are not selling 13,000, but we now sell 18,000 gigawatt hours, it would then mean that we'll be looking at 18,000 gigawatt hours answering to all the revenue requirements, vis-a-vis 12,000 answering to that requirement. So if we can push the demand, definitely it would be possible to mitigate against the cost. So what Muga said is not very accurate. I would just encourage him to use more, and I also want him to live for long.
But we can borrow the truth. Okay. As we go, continuing to look at the high cost of consuming power in Kenya today, as we come off the break, you were talking about the fact, like, if more Kenyans could consume more power, essentially what we are saying is that what you would pay would reduce, or at least you would be able to get more for what you pay, isn't it? Either way, the price would come down from that. But there seems to be an issue here, that there are losses that are realized between the transmission and the consumption of power in Kenya today, that there are losses. The Auditor General came out and said something, and she was very clear in her report, that 20% of the power unconsumed by us, the users, right, is still charged, and we pay for it. This is what she said. These would translate in Kenya Power's books as losses between transmission and consumption. The argument being that we, the end user, should not have to pay for these losses, but that between Kenya Power and the IPPs, you should be able to mop up those losses. Why does that cost then come to us? Now, it seems like a bit of a mess for people to understand. Could you explain how that happens? Why is there a 20% loss, and why are we having to pay for it?
Thank you so much, and really thank you so much for the opportunity to be able to shed light on that. Any conductor, any electric conductor has resistance. I want to make it as simple as possible. And the best conductor, for example, is silver. It's followed by copper. And aluminium comes in 61% of what aluminium or what copper is able to. The moment you have any resistance in any cable, the longer it is, whatever conductor you use, the length of that conductor is going to determine the losses. So it is, if there was a conductor which is lossless, that means perfect conductivity, zero losses, you would actually, whatever you transmit is what you are going to receive at the very end.
Okay.
But the fact that we are using conductors that have a resistance, and maybe this is also something that I may need to clarify to the customers out there. Right now, Kenya Power, we have 345 substations. We have 82,000 kilometers of medium and high tension lines. We have 156,000 of low voltage lines. The longer the lines, the higher the losses. And so it is not, when somebody talks about the losses at 20%, it would appear to somebody that it can be zero. I would tell you it's impossible. Technically, electrically, it is impossible. Whenever you have conductors, there are losses. And you'll even notice this, that when you have a jumper cable for your vehicle, just extend it by double the length, and you'll notice it cannot jumpstart the vehicle.
You would not supply power to the end.
Yes, you will have losses.
Okay.
What would actually happen is, and the situation in the country, and maybe what I would possibly just assure the public is what we are really doing in that particular space. Let me give you an example. That there are a number of projects which currently the whole sector is doing to shorten the lines. Because the longer the lines, the higher the losses. You can't make them zero. But in the space for losses, there are two types of losses. There is what is called technical losses, which is by virtue of the conductors you're using, by virtue of the transformers, any equipment you use, any electrical equipment has losses. Even transformers themselves, they have losses. And now this is maybe something I may not want to give so much detail, but let me put it this way and do. That one always has to strike a balance between the cost and the losses you can allow.
Yes.
Like, for example, the best conductor, like I told you, is copper. But the moment you start using copper, it's very expensive. So most of our conductors are not copper. So the fact that we've already gone to aluminium is an indication that we are allowing certain amount of losses. Now, another factor that affects the losses is the thickness of the conductor. The thicker it is, the lower the losses. So again, because you want to make your infrastructure not very expensive, you have to strike a balance between how thick can I make my conductors to be without, again, making the cost too expensive. When you come to the space of transformers, they are very low losses transformers, but they are extremely expensive. Again, one has to strike a balance between what costs am I willing to forego in terms of the losses without making the project too expensive. Okay. But now, as an answer to that, because I would leave people hanging if I stopped at that point. One, and you notice there have been a number of investments in the energy sector. Let me give you an example. Right now, one of the most recent, maybe that was completed last year, is a transmission line we call Olkaria-Lesos-Kisumu. The purpose of that line was to shorten the distance of power from Olkaria reaching Kisumu. And in so doing, of course, reduce the losses. And another thing, if you are able, and I know for those who are able to go to Western Kenya, you will actually notice it's a very massive structure, meaning the conductors are quite thick. And the reason being, you want to reduce the losses in that direction. Because as it is today, one of our biggest challenges are these very long lines. And let me give you the example. For you to supply Kitale right now, or even supply Kapenguria, and supply western part of Kenya, we mainly get power from Tarkwel. And that power from Tarkwel, just notice this. It traverses a distance of 220 kilometers to reach a place called Lesos. Once it reaches Lesos, it comes another almost 50, 60 kilometers to Eldoret, a place called Rivertex. That makes about 200 and possibly 70 kilometers. Then you come at another 70 kilometers to reach Kitale, which brings it to almost 400 kilometers. So you are noticing that you are supplying a place, Kitale, which is only 100 kilometers, slightly more than 100 kilometers from Tarkwel, over a distance of 400 kilometers. Now, what is the solution to that? The solution to that is a project which is called Tarkwel Ortum Kitale, which reduces now the distance between Tarkwel and Kitale to only about 138 kilometers. So once that line is completed, that would mean you are then able to supply Kitale via a very short line and thus reduce the technical losses. Okay. Let me give you another example. For you to supply South Nyanza, which is one of the biggest areas really where we feel for in terms of the power quality challenges. To supply it right now, the journey traverse is you take off from, say, Olkaria, go all the way to a place called Kibos. Go down 7 kilometers, that's about 300 kilometers. Go to Kibos, which is another 7. Come back to a place called Moroni, which is possibly about 50, 60 kilometers. Go to a place called Jemosit, maybe another 60 or 70. Then go to Sotik, go to Gegati, and then go to Awendo. So if you look at the whole distance that you have traversed, maybe it could be close to 500 kilometers. Now, the project that is already planned is what is called Narok Bomet, which will just shorten so that from Olkaria, you go to Narok, which is just about 60 kilometers. You go to Bomet, maybe another 60, and already you're in that direction. So you would have shortened that and reduced the losses. So there are a number of projects. Another project which is also earmarked to address that challenge is one which is called Sondu Omabay Awendo. Now, that project, the contractor became bankrupt, so the project was not completed. But we are engaging the sector, and that's really what I want to assure the public, that we are no longer seeing one another as competitors, as at times maybe that perception was there, but we are rallying together all the sector players. I'm talking about Ketraco here, I'm talking about Kenyan, so that we look at what are our biggest challenges and how can we hack them. If not in the long run, what are some of the mitigating measures? And I would even want to mention a few. That right now, one of them we notice is because Leso substation is not ready. I've engaged Ketraco, I've engaged the ministry, and I'm telling them, why don't we do a temporary work in Lesos so that instead of traversing, because one of the things that I didn't mention even in talking about the journey, is that as it is today, we have a situation where power flows from Olkaria, it goes all the way to Kibos, which is about 300 kilometers, like I said, goes to the 7 kilometers to Mamboleo, comes back to Moroni, and then it comes back to Lesos. And you know, Lesos from Olkaria is just 200 kilometers. So when you follow how it has traversed, it would have gone again 400 kilometers to reach a place that is 200 kilometers away.
Please explain to me this, because, you know, every place you're mentioning, I know.
Even Mohoroni.
Okay.
Well, I come from Moroni.
Okay.
So, as you're talking, I'm actually seeing the journey. You know, the distance is like from point A to B. But you know what we're doing? We're going here, then coming here, then coming here, then going here. But this way we're supposed to be going. And then we go there. Why this pattern? There's some reason behind it, but I want to understand why this zigzag manner of moving power using the longest possible distance.
I think at the end I'll give you an honorary engineering degree. But for now, let me come with the answer. The main issue is there are certain projects which should have been completed and they were not completed. One of them is Lesos substation. Now, there was a project called Lesos Tororo, which was meant to complete the complex in Lesos. And that is really what has introduced that situation. But I was just explaining now why we are sorting. The reason why we are moving that very long path is because Lesos substation is not ready.
Okay.
But now, this is what we are doing as a temporary measure. We want to introduce a bay. For lack of a better word, we want to introduce a temporary transformer and a bay in Lesos, so that instead of now moving, like you have said, from Olkaria, bypass Lesos, and go directly to Kibos, and then go to Mamboleo, and then come to Moroni and come back to Lesos, what would then happen now is from Olkaria, we will just stop at Lesos, which is 220 kilometers away. And in so doing, we will actually have addressed the losses. Because like I said, the longer the line, the higher the losses. And maybe another factor I could have mentioned but I'm coming back to this, is the higher the voltage, the lower the losses. Whenever you double the voltage, you reduce the losses to a quarter.
Okay.
So that is to say then, part of the reason why that line was constructed, and it's a 400 kV line, is to to elevate the voltages so that you reduce the losses. But coming back to answer you, the reason why we are going all that round is because the projects which were to ensure that we have shorter links have not been completed.
Okay.
And it's that lack of completion which has actually resulted in that situation.
With the losses, who pays for these losses as of today?
Put it this way. The moment you generate power and you transmit, there are transmission losses. The moment you distribute, there are also distribution losses. So what eventually becomes available to be sold is what reaches the end user. And that is actually what is billed to the customer.
So the end user pays for these losses?
No, he pays for the units that they consume.
Okay.
They pay for the units that they consume.
However, once power is generated,
yes.
whether it is by IPPs
yes.
or whomever, it is paid for. They have contracts, isn't it?
Yes,
they
that is
will
true.
be paid for what they produce, isn't
True,
it?
true.
So at the end of the day, whether you who collects it, it is lost on the way, whether it's lost as you're going through all these many lines, at the end of the day, the end user who's putting on the light in their house pays for this. The question is, why can't the IPPs and the power generators shoulder those losses and they do not go to the end user?
Like, let me backtrack again. You recall, Ndu, that I said that when we consider, say, that last year, the units that was sold were 10,000 gigawatt hours. Now, it is that power, the 10,000 gigawatt hours, which us to pay all the sector agencies. Like I said, there is the cost for generation, there is the cost for transmission, and then there is the cost for distribution. So what is then passed to the customer, or rather in arriving at the tariff, you are looking at what are the units we are going to sell this year, and what are the tariff requirements for generation. And indeed, maybe for the sake of the public, almost 70% of what Kenya Power collects they actually pay the generators. So 70% of all those costs go to generators. Now, once you've identified that this is the estimate of what you are going to sell in terms of units, that is what you now use to compute what is going to be the unit cost that is then going to be levied to the customer.
Okay, a big ticket issue here also is the fuel cost. Fuel cost is applied to our bills, and we see that it is because of that bills then go really high. We have an example of a bill, 500 shillings bought in August last year, got you about 25.4 units. In August this year, it's getting you 15.5 units. Same amount of money, less units by 10. The fuel cost, VAT, all of these things are applied. Does Kenya Power have a role in that cost that we've seen, that huge change of cost?
No, it doesn't. Those are the cost of fuel is usually whenever thermos. There are actually mainly two components. There is the fact of once you dispatch the thermos, and I did mention before that when the hydrology, and you'll agree with me that the hydrology in the country has not been very good. When I talk about hydrology, I'm talking about the rains. And the dam levels. Now, when we have a situation where the hydrology or the dam levels are low, it then limits the amount of power that can be dispatched from the hydros. And whenever there is that shortfall, what really mainly comes in to fill that gap are the diesel generators. So that is to say, it will keep varying from month to month based on how much thermos were dispatched in that particular month to meet the requirement. The other component that actually contributes to the same is we have stations which are running on thermal generators. And one of the key ones, for example, would be the biggest would be Lodwar. Up to now, Lodwar is running on a generator. So that is to say their entire consumption is actually, or rather diesel is used to, or thermos are actually used to meet that need. But what we are doing, maybe from actually where I sit, is we've been brainstorming with my team to see what is possible. I know ultimately there are transmission lines which are planned for those areas.
Yeah.
Transmission lines to ensure that the grid reaches there, and then they can be weeded off from the use of thermos. But also what we are doing from where I sit is, are there some temporary measures even of extending the low voltage lines to actually meet the demand? Like I said, it's not ideal for one to use the low voltage lines to elongate to serve very long distances.
So that's a Kenya Power issue that Kenya Power needs to sort out, isn't it?
The one for thermos?
Using the low grade, the low voltage line.
No, that is a mitigation. It's actually a mitigation to alleviate that situation.
Okay.
But the ultimate is for a transmission line. And like I said before, the moment, let me give an example. If you use a 33 kV line, vis-a-vis using 66 kV, the losses in 66 kV will be a quarter that of 33. And when you use now 132 kV, which is the beginning of the transmission voltage, is going to be 1 over, the other one was a quarter, it's 1 over 16.
Okay.
So where you use 33 in comparison with using 132, the losses in 33 is 16 times what you would actually have encountered for 132. But we are saying, but in so doing, we are willing even to extend, say, a 66, just to get them off the thermos. First of all, to address the issue of reliability and the quality of power. And number 2, to remove the thermal dispatch.
So what I hear you saying is that solutions to the problems that we are speaking of exist.
Exactly, they do exist.
But there will be a cost to providing the solution. So then the question, if I may peg it what Ndu had asked, who then will pay for these costs? Because the solution is not beyond us. That's clear in my head from what you're saying. It is possible for people to receive cheap power. It's possible for us. That switching my lights off at 7 o'clock doesn't need to occur. Okay? So now,
How?
the how is a good question, but my real question is this. It's something that it befuddles me. Why does it take you, the MD of Kenya Power, to come and explain something that could have been explained a long time ago? Because the optics are that Kenya Power is fleecing us. That's the optics. When we had 20%, in my head, my consumption has been increased by 20% immediately. I don't want to hear Ketrako. I'm not interested. I don't want to hear Kenyan, because my bill comes from Kenya Power.
True.
So,
And then on the bills, we don't even actually see anymore where all of the percentages go to. So then we see
then I'll
the
fill
fleecing
in
is even.
I'll fill in
proper.
the blanks
It's
for me,
proper
for
fleecing.
myself. I will say they have removed all the details they used to give us because they want to add 20% immediately. And then I will go ahead and write an article and say precisely that, which is what I did on Sunday.
Voila.
Okay.
Thank you. I really appreciate the fact of this, the need for this engagement. We should be engaging more and more. On the issue, first of all, of reducing the content, this is a democratic space, and there are a lot of customers who are telling us, you are boring us with too much detail. Just shorten this. And we heeded their call. But also for those who want to get the details of the bill, they just need to use 977 hash, and you'll actually star 977 hash, and you'd be able to get all the details of your bill. Yes, I think in terms of the conversation, the issue is that there are a number of things that need to be done. And maybe let me also appreciate what the government is doing. We are actually encouraging even PPPs to do some of the transmission lines. So we are encouraging, or rather the government has been encouraging private sector participation in terms of putting some of the critical lines that need to be done. There is a document in the government which is called Least Cost Development Power Plan. The Least Cost Development Power Plan gives a detail of all that need to be done to address all the challenges in the energy sector, going all the way to 2040. The lines that need to come, the reinforcements that need to be put in place, and all that detail is available. And what the government has been doing through the Ministry of Energy is really to encourage even the private sector to come into that space. And maybe just to assure also the consumers that going forward, one of the ideas that is really being sold, and maybe it is also very useful to understand even the dynamics of the region, there is what is called the East African Power Pool. And in the East African Power Pool, this is a concept where you want to link the power pools from, there is one which is for South Africa, there is another one for Western Africa, and there is also now what is called the East African Power Pool. Ultimately, all these power pools are going to be connected. And where the future is moving towards is a regime which is called the energy auction, where instead of having farm contracted capacities, people will actually be auctioning their power and saying, this is the amount of power I have, and these are the prices. And of course, looking at where it's generated and where it's required, those are the things that will determine then who is actually going to dispatch. So in terms of that particular aspect, yes, we encourage the private sector participation. But even importantly, there is also an aspect which the public can come to play in this particular space.
Right.
I did mention that there is what is called technical losses, but there is also what is now called commercial losses. And this is where really even the members of the public can assist us. And these commercial losses are the ones which come mainly as a result of, say, illegal connections. People have connected themselves directly.
Things.
And so they are using power that is not metered.
Yeah, and it's essentially illegal.
Exactly. That is so that those illegal connections actually do contribute. And then the other thing that does contribute to also the challenges is the vandalism.
Sure.
Vandalism has a heavy toll on us. I do remember a week ago, I think, where we lost about 7 transformers over a weekend. And you see, when you lose a transformer over a weekend and you look at the losses over the year, the number really has to be compensated for.
Engineer Siror, it's, I think, imperative that you come back. There are many questions, many conversations that need to continue around power in this country. Good that you were here with us this morning, and we're going to extend the invitation for you to come back another day, isn't it?
Absolutely.
This is the Situation Room, the only way to start your day.